the commandment to honor your father and mother, and what does that mean, and what does that look like? And that's when I talk about in several places. I don't think there's a single right way to honor your father and mother. And this is where, even though the commandments are so brief, I think they invite us into a more expansive application in our life, that for me to honor my parents might look different than the way that you honor your parents. And so, going back to our previous conversation, if the Ten Commandments are kind of absolutes in how they're presented, I think they're also like case laws, in the fact that in the case of my specific life and my specific relationship with my parents, it will look different than someone else's relationship. So I find it really like a lovely invitation for us to figure out how we're going to receive and apply these commandments.
Hello and welcome to It Means What It Means, the podcast in which a guy with some college and a day job has long-form conversations about biblical texts. Today's guest is Sara Koenig, and the conversation centers around the Ten Commandments, specifically how it was received, interpreted, understood, applied throughout its history. So the book that we discuss straddles both Christian and Jewish approaches. And for something that's in the news even now, 25, 30 years ago, when I was a kid in school, there were controversies and arguments around the public display of the Ten Commandments, and that's still the case. And I would encourage anyone listening, go pick up this book, because we run the risk of the Ten Commandments becoming a superficial thing when they are, for the most part, understood through these public debates and disagreements and culture war arguments. Not much more to say there. It's worth me backing off and throwing things to the conversation. But before I do, I will say, if you're listening for free, please go follow, support, rate, subscribe, review, all of those things on your platform of choice. Follow on social media, YouTube, Facebook, Instagram, Twitter, Spoutable, Threads, really any social media platform you can find the podcast. Additionally, though, head on over to patreon.com/itmeanswhatitmeans and kick in $5 a month. That's all from me. I don't have any more business to discuss, so enjoy my conversation with Sara Koenig. I'll be back at the end of the episode to set up next week's. Sara Koenig, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you for having me. It's great to be here.
Before we get going, will you tell us a little bit about yourself?
Sure. I'm a Washington State native, which is a little bit rare these days. Born in the Seattle area, and then I did my graduate work at Princeton Seminary in New Jersey, both master's and PhD there, in Old Testament studies. My focus was on the character of Bathsheba at the time, but then I got interested in this field of reception history, and so my recent book is on the Ten Commandments. I live in Seattle. I teach at my undergrad alma mater, Seattle Pacific University, and I live in Seattle. I have a college-age daughter, a high school-age son, and a dog.
What kind of dog?
A Labrador Retriever. Okay. Yeah, she's 8 years old, so she's pretty lazy and slow these days, but very affectionate.
All right. You got a lot going on there then.
Yeah.
Okay, so today we're going to be discussing your book from Eerdmans, The Ten Commandments Through the Ages. And this is one of those where it's just kind of like, yeah, that's a no-brainer, the Ten Commandments. But I do appreciate that it's, I think, a unique, or at least to maybe the general public, a unique approach, which is reception history. So would you mind, what is reception history and why is it the framework that you're using for this book?
Yes. Reception history has sometimes been referred to as history of interpretation, the history of how a given text has been understood and interpreted throughout the ages, throughout time. And reception history, however, is slightly distinct in that some of the emphasis is on the people who are doing the receiving of it. So history of interpretation can be a little bit more general, where reception history does say there are actual historical people who have received this text in a particular way, have understood it in a way, have applied it in a particular way. And there's an analogy that I refer to in the book from another scholar of reception history, and he compares it a little bit to American football, where part of the goal of the game, the purpose of the game, is that a receiver gets the ball and then moves it down the field in some way. And so he's arguing that whenever people read the Bible, they receive it, but then they do something with it. They use it in a particular way. So reception history is looking back at how people have understood it, have applied it throughout time, and in different cultures as well.
I think American football is a pretty good analogy there too, because I remember hearing it was about like a Native American Indian school, but it was very early in the development of football, and they were talking about how like there was no passing
Mm,
um, in the sport at that time, but because the boys from this school were smaller than the boys from some of these other Ivy League schools, when they were playing them, they had to kind of manipulate the rules to make use of this passing, which is now a regular part. And I think there's a lot of negotiation with biblical texts or engaging with biblical texts, that whether you're talking about um, Eastern Orthodox as opposed to Catholic, or Catholic as opposed to Protestant, or 16th century as opposed to 21st century, there are so many rule changes, and we
yes.
all just kind of think, well, it was always thus, but you come to find
Mhm.
out over time, no, not everybody who's done this has done it the way you do it.
Yeah, and to push the analogy even a little further, as far as I understand, in football, there's common plays that everyone knows and uses. You do something where you pass it to one person and then you move in a different way. But at the same time, if there's only a single way to move the ball down the field, then everyone always knows it. And so you wouldn't actually get very far with it. And so, yes, I love that idea that in the different times and contexts, people have different ways of moving it in their own setting.
Yeah. So how are we going to gain yardage here with the Ten Commandments?
Exactly. Yes.
let's
Yeah.
let's really tear the seams of this
Right.
analogy.
Let's push it so far that it becomes absurd. Yeah. Yeah.
Okay, so where do you decide to begin with the reception history?
That's yes. In some ways, I think the reception starts within the larger biblical text itself. So the Ten Commandments, of course, being in the book of Exodus, chapter 20, but then they're also repeated in Deuteronomy 5. And then even in the book of Exodus, you've got the Ten Commandments, but then they get a little bit more explained and unpacked later on in Exodus in the book of the covenant. So the command, for example, the commandment, don't murder, don't kill, it's incredibly brief in the Hebrew, just 2 words. But then just a few chapters later, we get some more explanation of, well, here's where killing would be punishable by death. Here's where killing is more permissible. If someone makes a mistake and kills someone by accident, then there's a city of refuge where they can flee. So you've got the really brief, succinct commandments themselves, but then they get received just a few chapters later as they get unpacked, moved down the field again, to return to our analogy, and explained. And then later on in the text, besides just the legal sections of the text, you have the commandments received in some of the narratives. So the story of David and Bathsheba in 2 Samuel 11, David murders, commits adultery, steals Bathsheba from Uriah, covets, you can argue. So the fact that you have these things very clearly prohibited early in Exodus, and then later in the narrative in 2 Samuel, you see them being received in a different way, or maybe just explained further on. So I think it starts with the text itself. And then, in terms of where I decided to go historically, one of the daunting things about writing this book is there has been so much that has been written and commented on about the Ten Commandments, a well known piece of the biblical text. So early on, I decided there's no way that a single book that I write could be exhaustive, but I try to do representative things. So looking at it in the ancient world as much as I could, making sure I had some receptions from the medieval era, from the Enlightenment, from the Reformation, and then into the contemporary world, even with popular culture, how it's been received in those places as well.
This is kind of a digression, but I I have the other book. Like it's in my room. Actively working my way through it. But Rebecca Eklund, I'm not sure. Am I saying, yeah, the
Yes.
Beatitudes through the ages. I did not associate, like, again, your book is in my house because I know we
Yeah,
have
yeah.
this scheduled, and I'm reading through that book, and then until I guess it was SBL or the SBL Press. They posted something on, I think, Instagram, and it was those two books next to each other on display there in the convention hall. And I was like, oh, is there? And I understand that they are separate, portions. They are separate biblical texts. But is that an intentional thing that these are published as kind of companions, or how does that work?
Exactly. And that's how it was framed when Erdman's reached out to talk with me about this book, that they had published Rebecca's book on the reception history of the Beatitudes. And it's a lovely book. I highly recommend it. And they said, we were interested in doing a companion piece with something in the Old Testament and maybe the Ten Commandments. So the short answer to your question is yes, absolutely. That's how the publisher wanted to present these as companions. And it's also, well, two things. One is that thinking about the Ten Commandments as a companion to the Beatitudes, or if you want to refer to the Beatitudes as a commandment, as a companion to the Ten Commandments, is another really interesting way to think about it. These sort of short sections of text that have some instructions for how you live, that both of them have within the Bible itself, they're repeated. So 10 commandments in Exodus and Deuteronomy, and then the Beatitudes in Matthew and Luke. But then also to say, what do they have in common with each other and what not? And also, since it's a companion book, it wasn't like I needed to fully draw on everything that Rebecca Eklund had done with her book. And yet she also kind of gave me permission in the way that she would, as she describes the Beatitudes, she'll have a comment from Billy Graham right next to a church father's commentary on it. And she talks about that. And there's something lovely about, I think, putting these ideas together in reception history to say, actually, the way that those different interpreters in time and history read the text maybe have some similarities with one another. So I was trying to do that with my book as well.
I remember hearing when I was a teenager, this was pretty sharp departure from my Baptist evangelical upbringing and approach to biblical text, but somebody explaining Hebrews 12, I think 24, as like the idea of Christian worship is we're all doing the same, like we're all in each other's presence, not
Mm,
because we're with each other, but because and and that being a way like you're approaching worship or biblical texts together. I think that's an interesting, like, hey, this is a nexus point for you across time and space. I know that
yeah.
if that's a bit of an overreach, that's I'm willing to take that.
No, I love that. I mean, I think there's something about understanding that great cloud of witnesses is we've got something in common that we're trying to figure out. What does it look like to be faithful to the commandments we've been given, to live a life that God wants us to live, and that there's something that I'm doing today in 2025 that maybe is similar to something that someone during the Protestant Reformation was trying to do. Or yeah, I like that idea. And also, I would say the thing that I've appreciated about reception history is it gives me examples of how there's no single one right way to apply or understand or interpret the biblical text. And so, because you can see these examples of, they might have some similarities with them, and yet you also have in different times, different places, different people receiving it in quite different ways. And I think that is a testament to the richness of the biblical text, that it's not so simplistic that it only means one thing or can only be applied in one very small, narrow way.
Which is a pretty good transition into the Exodus and Deuteronomy I guess, depictions or
Yeah.
appearances of the Ten Commandments. So, how are those? How do those differ in, I guess, in their presentation in the biblical text, and then are they approached and utilized in different ways
Mm,
throughout history?
yeah. Good question. There's obviously a lot of similarities. The Ten Commandments get repeated in Exodus and in Deuteronomy, as I've said multiple times, with some differences. And some of the differences are quite minor, such as a preposition in one that doesn't occur in the other. I think there's something like 20 quite minor differences. Some of the more substantial differences include the rationale for keeping the Sabbath. Both Exodus and Deuteronomy have the commandment to keep a Sabbath. But according to Exodus, the reason why we keep a Sabbath goes back to the Genesis 1 story in creation, that God rested on the seventh day. And therefore, that's why we humans are to create a Sabbath. In Deuteronomy, when Sabbath commandment is given, the rationale goes back to the Exodus, or before the Exodus, that the reminder is you were slaves in Egypt and God brought you out of there, therefore keep a Sabbath. And so, in the different, again, the commandment is the same, but the reason why, the motivation is different between Exodus and Deuteronomy. So that's the main substantial difference. Another difference has to do with the coveting commandment. In Deuteronomy, you have the addition of don't covet your neighbor's field. And many have thought that that's because the Israelites are about to enter into the promised land where they will own land. And so they want to include field as a specific thing not to covet, even though both covet commandments in Exodus and Deuteronomy have that catch all, anything that belongs to your neighbor. But the other coveting difference is that in Deuteronomy, it says, do not covet your neighbor's wife first, whereas wife is included a little bit later on in the list in Exodus. And so, because Deuteronomy says, don't covet your neighbor's wife, and then don't covet all these other things, some people who list out the Ten Commandments separate out the coveting command into two separate commandments. So a single commandment, don't covet your neighbor's wife, and then second, don't covet everything else that your neighbor has, which gets into another issue with the Ten Commandments of how do we number 10? How do we get to 10? So the reason we have 10 commandments has to do with Exodus 34:28, and that's after the golden calf incidents, after Moses had broken the two tablets, the original two tablets, and then the covenant gets remade with God in Exodus 34. And Exodus 34:28 specifies that he wrote on the tablets the words of the commandments, the 10 words. So we get the number 10 from that verse in Exodus. So everyone refers to them as the 10 commandments, but not everyone agrees on which one is number one, which one is number seven. For example, there's different ways of ordering. So, kind of running on here. I don't know if you want to interrupt
No,
and ask the
no,
clarifying
keep,
question.
nope, nope.
So again, everyone agrees that there are 10 based on that verse in Exodus 34:28. But the major differences have to do with which one is number one, and the early ones and then the later ones. So in Judaism, their first commandment is something that Christians tend to treat as the prologue, which is the statement, I am the Lord your God who brought you out of the land of Egypt, period. So for Jews, that's word number one. And then the second one would be no gods, no idols. And I find that really interesting because there's nothing explicitly commanded in that statement. I am the Lord your God who brought you out of the land of Egypt. And yet it's been explained as there's an implied commandment: know that God exists, know that God is your God, and then also remember what God has done for you. So there's no direct imperative in that statement, and yet there's an invitation there to know God, to be in a relationship with God, to remember what God has done. So again, in Judaism, that's the first word. The other place that there's disagreement between how you divide them has to do with the commandment about worshiping God and worshiping other gods. So is no gods, no idols a single combined commandment, or is it separated out into two distinct commandments? Different Christians have divided that differently throughout the ages. Some saying one commandment is don't have any other gods. And then the second commandment, don't make an idol, would be more in reference to prohibiting making any image of that one God that you're already worshiping. You're not worshiping any other gods, it's a separate command. And then don't make an idol or an image of that God. Or a lot of people combine those into into a single commandment: no gods, no idols, don't worship anything else besides God.
So where do we see that appear in Christian reception?
Yes, you see it appear there's a chart that I have between Roman Catholics and Lutherans combine that into a single commandment: no gods, no idols. Whereas in Eastern Orthodoxy and with most Protestants, they make them into two separate commandments: no gods, and then no idols or images. And what becomes really interesting about that is there's some Reformed churches on the East Coast, for example, that if you've ever gone into them, they just look like a box inside. They don't even have a cross up inside the sanctuary, because even an image like a cross could be understood as breaking this commandment: don't make an image that would be representative of God. It's also interesting to me that this is within Eastern Orthodoxy, because Eastern Orthodoxy has such a rich traditions of icons, of course, but they don't see that as breaking this commandment. They don't see it as making an image of God.
And I mean, that is part of the fight between, the like quote Western and Eastern
Yeah,
part of it anyway. But no, that is an interesting. I wouldn't even say it's a contradiction. It just probably looks like a contradiction from the outside. I think in
yeah,
practice, because you don't pray to an icon, right? You pray with an icon.
yeah. With or sometimes even through is how I've understood. But yeah, it becomes a way to pray, but you're not praying to it.
Okay.
Yeah,
Anybody who wants to come on here and talk about that, you're welcome to. Because neither of
yeah,
us is an expert.
right.
I'm assuming. Okay.
Yeah. The other place that I'll say is that I was talking about this a little bit earlier. The distinction between how you number the commandments have to do with the covet command. Is it a single commandment, don't covet anything, or is it distinct, don't covet your neighbor's wife? And that's where the difference between the Deuteronomy and Exodus versions of the Ten Commandments seems to say, well, they put wife first in Deuteronomy, so that's distinct from coveting all the other things that your neighbor has. So,
Sorry, I'm trying to remember the terms, and they appear so early in the book. So I grabbed the book, but it's basically what one is about cases, and the other one is just. Is that? Let me know if this is ringing any bell. Like causal, I think. Why am I blanking on this? I was just
oh,
apodictic and causistic. I don't know what, or
yeah,
casuistic. I don't know why I was
yes,
having trouble remembering those terms. Um,
yeah,
can you break those terms down and why they
definitely.
apply?
Yeah. Apodictic or just absolute law is law that is absolute. There's no rationale given for it. So the Ten Commandments seem to be apodictic, absolute law, just don't steal, period. There's no explanation given of any place where you could steal or when stealing wouldn't be as bad. Whereas casuistic or case law is presented as, if this were to happen, then this is what you're prohibited from doing. So it gives a little bit more explanation of why the law is there. And in this case, killing wouldn't be prosecuted in a certain way. Apodictic, absolute law, the implied punishment is death. So don't steal, period. If you steal, you will be punished by death. But then case law will again, give a little bit fuller explanation saying, if you happen to, I'm going to switch commandments here, if you happen to kill someone and it was accidental, you didn't realize how hard you were hitting the person, that's one of the laws in Exodus, then if it wasn't premeditated or pre-planned, then you won't be killed for killing another person. So that's a distinction between absolute and case law. And most people see the Ten Commandments as being, again, more absolute.
So there's a sci-fi fantasy author named Adrian Tchaikovsky, and sorry to be name dropping. I had him on the podcast and we talked about this series,
Right.
the Tyrant Philosophers. But there is a god named God who is a healing god. And so if I am a priest of this god and you are dying, you have a wound that will kill you, I will offer you, if you believe and commit to serve my god, your wound will be healed. But the catch is, if you are healed, you can never do harm to anyone ever again. And if you
Wow.
do, the healing is removed. So the chest wound that was healed, that you were dying from, will come back and you will die. And what ends up happening is these people they're not really thinking because they're dying. And they receive this healing, not understanding the consequences are you are now stuck with the commitment to this healing for the rest of your life.
Wow.
And so one of the people who kind of ends up boxed in that way, she starts to investigate to see, like, well, what are the rules? Like, what are the circumstances? Because if you even think, like, if someone tries to rob you and you even think about doing them physical harm, you'll start to feel that healing leaving, and then you have to back off of that. So she basically starts a new movement of people who are following this God, but they have these rules. Like, she writes these rules down, and it just that like that what you're saying there made me think of, this is both this, like,
Yes.
if you
Yeah.
don't obey, don't ever hurt anybody, you will, if your wound was to that extent, you will die. But how do you navigate life knowing that you cannot do harm? Well, can I do so looking at the what are the cases where I may be
Yes.
able to act in a way that's normal, and what are the cases where I can't? That was, yeah. So well done, Adrian Tchaikovsky. But
Yes. I'm going to have to look at those books now. That sounds great.
absolutely, he also has one about sentient spiders, and which is, yeah, he's really good, really good.
Yeah.
Um,
But
but
part of
sorry, go
what part
ahead.
of what you're saying there too, I mean, again, the absolute, if we read the Ten Commandments as just absolute, if you ever, break these, you're going to die. And then we look at David, who breaks at least maybe five of them, depending on how you count them, and he doesn't die. And when Nathan comes to him, says, "You're not going to die. Actually, your child dies," which is a whole other challenging theological issue to deal with. But again, it's not quite as absolute as it might seem. There are some other rules to it, some other ways of applying it in life that make it, frankly, a little bit more interesting to me than just a simple black and white absolute.
So I know we're both Americans, and one of the things, particularly growing up in churches, that I always heard is, like, the Ten Commandments, the Bible, it's a foundation of the rule of law.
Mhm.
But a lot of what I've learned about common law systems, which is what we seem to have inherited from the UK, uh, they are a little bit more complex. But it does seem to kind of mesh up with what I've learned about biblical law too, especially some of the stuff you've said here today. So was the Ten Commandments are a foundation of our laws? Is that an after? And it's, I understand you're not writing about American history. Is that like an afterthought, like a theological thing thrown in, or do you think that that was like for Christendom leading up to America? The Ten Commandments have been just like, oh yeah, yeah, no, these are obviously foundational because they're divinely brought down.
Yeah, it's such a good question. I appreciate your acknowledgement that I'm not an expert at all in American law or American history in that way. I think what I see is that some of the commandments that have a little bit more to do with how we treat humans, sometimes what people refer to as the second tablet of the law, that those seem to be kind of basic morals of legal systems. What I find so fascinating about even some debates today about the display of the Ten Commandments is that the first of the commandments are so focused on right worship of God. And from what I understand in American law, the separation between church and state being so foundational from the start, it seems like you'd have to ignore those first few commandments that have to do with how do we think of God, and that those aren't a piece of our American legal system. Some of the kind of basic foundational ideas of don't murder, don't steal, those things seem to me more applicable and foundational than the ones that have to do with how do we talk about God? How do we use God's name or not? So I think it's maybe a both and in that way, that there's aspects of them that seem to be really core to a basic civic morality. And yet, after studying them, so many of them are really focused on worship, which is hard to legislate.
See, I think it's that theological language that is motivating people. And I'm saying this
Yeah,
as a
yeah.
as a parent in Texas where this is actively a
Oh,
thing. I,
yes.
I think it's almost as if um, a reference to or acknowledgement of divinity is seen as like
Mm,
a shibboleth that indicates good citizenship. And
right.
yeah, and it's just this shorthand that I think they're actually. And hey, again, if somebody has a problem with this, you can come on and talk to me. This is not Sara Koenig's fault. I'm saying these
Yeah.
words that they're actually more concerned with the first part than with the second
Mm,
part because it's an acknowledgement of their religious and theological point of view more so than it
yeah.
is about good citizenship. I think they assume having those things there forces people to acknowledge a thing that they think naturally flows into peaceful, ordered society.
Yeah. Well, and what a great point, which also kind of illustrates something else I love about reception history is how much our context matters. So even though you and I are Americans talking in 2025, you living in Texas is very different than me living in Seattle, and kind of some of the larger conversations. No one in the Seattle public schools is talking about trying to display the Ten Commandments. And part of that I think is maybe more of the sense of a commitment to multiculturalism and recognizing that in our schools we've got Muslims and atheists and those, and that's kind of part of the water here. But also, I think you're exactly right that there is this move in American politics today that's trying to pull in. Um, I don't know how I'd say this without it sounding too critical, kind of a divine I don't know, blessing or sanctioning for the way we do things. For the way you put it very nicely, being a good citizen is connected to acknowledging the Christian God. I sometimes even wonder if it's the Judeo-Christian God as much anymore, just a Christian God.
I think it has become the Judeo-Christian God. So. Okay, so we are for the audience out there because they don't really know this. It's
Yeah.
early December 2025. I've already watched Home Alone. I'm in Christmas. Like I watched it on Thanksgiving. That's when my Christmas season begins. Uh, and I'm looking forward to watching It's a Wonderful Life. And we'll
Hmm.
we'll probably watch that as close to Christmas as any of the other movies that we're going to watch. And I will say, so that is a movie that is popular culture, and it acknowledges the existence of a God. But I put that in a moral like mindset in the same place that I would put Kurt Vonnegut and Alan Alda, who, to
Hmm.
my knowledge, have no association with overt religious commitment. For sure, Vonnegut doesn't, but
Yeah.
it's like a moral framework that is more concerned with citizenship than with an overt religious or theological commitment. But
Yes.
for a lot of people, you get to that civic engagement because of their religious or theological acknowledgement. And I think that there are people, it's a reactionary approach. There are people who think that that civic identity is under threat
Mm,
because people are either less inclined or less comfortable or just openly, I guess, aggressive toward or combative toward that religious or theological assertion. And so
yeah.
the response to that down here in the Lone Star State is, we're putting it all over, like we're displaying the 10 Commandments all over the schools. And I think they see those things as somehow intertwined. I
Yeah.
I do look, as much as nostalgia is worthwhile. I think, and I'll throw Ralph Nader in there too. I think if you listen to what Vonnegut, Alan Alda, Frank Capra movies have to say about citizenship, I understand why people are nostalgic for that time. I
Hmm.
think they miss the point of the substance, though, and I will. I know
Yeah.
that was a bit of rambling. That's not necessarily on the topic of the Ten Commandments, but I picked my own scab, and now here we are.
Well, I was just talking with some colleagues this morning about how where is a sense of kind of duty, like a positive sense of duty or responsibility to the other, that been sort of eroded in today. And I actually agree that I think for some people, the idea that we get back to that sense of responsibility for another through God, if you have that faith framework. And I think to talk about the Ten Commandments, many have noted the ordering that they start with commandments about our relationship with God, and then they move to relationship commandments about our relationships with other humans. And many people have commented on the fact that if you've got a right relationship with God, then it will order your right relationship with other people as well. And as a Christian myself, I believe that. I also think, as I see secular humanists around me, I don't know that you always have to start with God to still have a sense of responsibility and care for other humans through that. But as a Christian, it makes sense to me that you start there. I guess I'm more wary of saying you have to believe in the God of Christianity in order to be a responsible, loving human. But yeah, that's kind of maybe more worldview philosophy there.
I mean, there is definitely a tension there. So before we got on here this morning, I had a conversation with a prospective, a rabbi who is a prospective guest, and we still haven't booked a date. And I tend to not talk about these things publicly, for
Yeah.
like with any detail, until it's recorded. So I'll just say a rabbi, prospective guest, and we were talking about the history that Jews and Christians have had, which
Hmm.
Jews have come out more on the receiving end of punishment than
Yes.
Christians have. And in acknowledging that, talking about the dialogue that's going on right now, that is beginning, that is hopeful between Christians and Jews. And I said, I feel like the next step is we start to ask, like, what is love? And his
Hmm.
response back was, kind of a like, well, we don't trust you guys to
Hmm.
love.
Yeah.
And when I said, well, love isn't the things we feel, it's the things we do, he was like, be careful, they're gonna think you're Jewish. And I
Yeah.
think that kind of, and I know that's kind of a circuitous way to get back to what you said, but the feelings of, well, I have love or affection or whatever, they can be deceptive, but the
Hmm.
actions, the what you do. And so I would say if someone can communicate to me through their actions that their relationship with God is right, then great. But I think what I'm going to see more, I don't know that a lot of that's going to be visible to me. I think what
Yeah.
I'm going to see more is their relationships with other people. And so
Hmm.
are they doing right by other people? Are they actively loving other people? And
Yeah.
if they're not, I don't care what they have to say about God.
Yeah.
I'm not.
Yeah.
I'm just not interested. Like, hey, great, live your life, but the conversation, it's not happening in between you and me. But if I see that someone, and I don't care what they do or don't believe in, if I see someone loving someone else, like
Hmm.
we're on the same team.
Yeah.
So, and and in that regard, like, hey, not bearing false witness, I don't think we're going to find a ton of disagreement between people we think are decent. But I can tell you, and I know this is kind of skewing, but like the the Gordon Gecko thing has been in my head a lot for the last few
Mm.
days. The greed is good, like
Mm.
people telling us that, like, well, it's okay to lie for the right cause, or it's okay to be greedy
Right.
for the right cause. Like, maybe we should isolate those people a little bit more,
Right.
whether they
Right. Yeah.
believe in a god or not. And I know that that's kind of yeah, this is all digression, so I will try to get us back on track. When I was a
Yeah.
teenager, the idea, I don't know if someone told me this explicitly or if I just inferred this from some other information, I had this idea that like the Ten Commandments were a condensation, I get, or a compression of the 1613 laws throughout Hebrew Bible. A- Again, I can't attribute it to anyone because I don't remember where I came up with this. Is that true? Is that wrong? Like what was going on in my brain there, Sarah?
Well, you're certainly not alone with that. I mean, it's yeah, a condensation or a distillation. I mean, that's so many people have talked about that the Ten Commandments themselves could be broken down into two larger commandments or maybe two sets of umbrellas: love God and love your neighbor. And so, if you want to, you could just say those are the two commandments. Of course, that's what Jesus is talking about, these two great commandments. Interesting that those aren't actually in the Ten Commandments themselves, the love of God from Deuteronomy 6:5, and then the love of neighbor from Leviticus 19:18. But again, seeing those as a way of understanding the Ten Commandments, which relates to what you were saying earlier, that love isn't just a feeling, it's known in what you do. How do you love God? Well, don't use God's name in a vain way. How do you love God? Keep a Sabbath. How do you love your neighbor? Don't speak falsely against them. So again, the love gets enacted, which I think is a really important way to think about how do we know love. But yes, so then the Ten Commandments then is being a way of, you could put all of the other laws into the Ten Commandments in some way or another. So um, the don't steal part of that, you could put underneath that umbrella, don't move the boundary lines. You've got that specific law. So again, just how do we care for people? How do we love people? So yes, seeing the Ten Commandments themselves as a distillation of all the other laws, but even if you want to get them down to just two, you could do that as love God and love neighbor.
Okay. I got a little bit nervous that that idea was floating around in the back of my head the more that I've learned about, as you've said, that the creation of biblical texts, that engagement with biblical texts, the changing interpretations around
Mm-hmm.
and of biblical texts, that I wondered, like, well, it's just a more dynamic process of these laws coming to be codified than just uh, for American listeners, like the US code sections will apply to certain things. So you'll go over to, Title 10 or Title 9 or whatever, and that's an
Yeah.
overall heading. And then there are specific provisions within those things. But I don't,
Yeah.
I started to get a little bit suspicious that, like, I don't think that's how this operates.
Well, and actually, now as I'm thinking about it, I don't know that every single one of the 613 laws could neatly fit under the Ten Commandments. I mean, you have so many laws in so many different realms that some would fit nicely, like all the other explanations of murdering, cities of refuge, those things. But now I'm wondering, where would I put all the wandering ox laws? Maybe under, so you've got those, or even all the slave laws or the war law. I mean, so maybe it doesn't, to understand them as just a distillation would be maybe oversimplifying laws. I guess I'd probably want to say I think the Talmud could be a better way of organizing laws in those different categories, maybe similar to the law code that would have distinct topics where you could talk a lot about Sabbath and related laws in one section, but then also talk about kind of household laws in a different one. So that might be a better way of talking about an aggregate. But then those also get big too. So sometimes I think about the law in the Hebrew Bible, the Old Testament, is almost like an accordion. Like sometimes it gets compressed and then sometimes it gets expanded, and you kind of have both and so to do too much expansion, it just starts to get big, and yet also to over compress would be to miss some of the subtleties and nuance that you find.
I feel like accordion is the answer I didn't know I was looking for. No, it's the right answer I didn't know
Yeah.
that I needed. Because I was like, I had the sneaking suspicion that it was a reductive
Yes.
understanding of Judaism from the
Yeah.
understanding of, like, oh, Old Testament or Hebrew Bible that existed as, it's the, I like to use the term, it's the cold open for Jesus,
Mm.
and what
Yeah.
really matters, like the actual stuff, happens later, but it's like, no, to accept it on its own terms is going to be a
Hmm.
lot more respectful. It's going to be a lot more work, but that's
Yeah.
where the accordion. Yeah. Thank you, Sarah
Yeah, you're
Koenig.
welcome. Yeah. Yeah. Well, and even so much of what Jesus does is very much in line with what we see previously in the laws that we've found early. I mean, people often say, well, Jesus makes it have to do with the heart. And I'm like, but the heart is also in these Hebrew texts as well. Like something even like the commandment to covet. How do you know if someone covets or not? I mean, that's an interesting thing of the maybe if someone covets their neighbor's horse because they steal their neighbor's horse, but even just the fact that the commandment to covet, that's an internal disposition more than just simply an action that can be prohibited or prevented. And so when Jesus is talking about things in the Sermon on the Mount, for example, where he says, he tends to make it internal, he's just following the pattern that we already see in the laws in Leviticus and Exodus and Deuteronomy.
Yeah, man, I just noticed the time, and I have I have followed rabbit trails for much longer than I thought I had. So because I asked so many like 30,000 foot questions, I like to kind of transition into the close by asking: was there anything from the book you were hoping I would ask about that has not come up today?
Oh, yeah, what a great question. This is a not necessarily because this was, again, such a big project. I never felt like I could be exhaustive with it, but I tried to be representative. And there's chapters on each of the commandments, including the Jewish first word, I am the Lord your God who brought you out of the land of Egypt. And so one of the questions that has been interesting for me to think about is, do I have a favorite commandment? And I don't know that I have a single favorite one. I find it really interesting to think about the commandment to honor your father and mother, and what does that mean and what does that look like. And that's when I talk about in several places, I don't think there's a single right way to honor your father and mother. And this is where, even though the commandments are so brief, I think they invite us into a more expansive application in our life, that for me to honor my parents might look different than the way that you honor your parents. And so going back to our previous conversation, if the Ten Commandments are kind of absolutes in how they're presented, I think they're also like case laws, in the fact that in the case of my specific life and my specific relationship with my parents, it will look different than someone else's relationship. So I find it really like a lovely invitation for us to figure out how we're going to receive and apply these commandments. And so there's some basic principles. The word honor, the Hebrew word kavod, being related to this idea of weight or substance, and the opposite of it would be something light, something that has no you can just sort of brush off. So I understand that as saying the way I honor my parents is to treat them as if they have substance and weight, and I don't just treat them as if they mean nothing lightly. But what that looks like, I mean, if I have a pretty good relationship with my parents, who are elderly, and so what does it look like to honor them at this stage and age in their life, is very different than someone who might have estranged parents or abusive parents or narcissistic parents. So I, in general, find that writing this book was really helpful for me to think about it in that framework, in those terms of the Ten Commandments as being invitational.
And then who was it? One of the kings. His father was not good, but he
Right. Yeah.
decided, I'm going to honor my father, David.
Yes. Yeah.
I
Yeah. So parents, not just your literal father and mother, but your ancestors, those who've come before you. Yeah.
like Alan Alda and Kurt Vonnegut.
Yeah.
I guess I'm trying to win a record for like most mentions of Alan Alda in a podcast that's not about
Yeah.
MASH or the West Wing. Um,
No.
and you can be as expansive as you like. I know that you're works cited, your bibliography in this book, that is a good place to go. But what would you recommend that the audience read, watch, listen to, whatever, to get a better understanding of the Ten Commandments and their reception throughout history.
Yeah, yeah. As you mentioned, there's a few books that I referenced and drew on quite a bit. Um, I actually think I would recommend reading Luther's catechisms on the Ten Commandments because I think, and those are readily available just online, free, both shorter and larger catechism where he talks about the Ten Commandments. I think he's got a lot to say about what this might mean. And again, it's in his setting and context in Protestant Reformation Germany, but there's some really interesting ways that he explains how we live out the Ten Commandments that I think are quite applicable. A couple more recent books. There's one edited by Rachel Mikva called Broken Tablets, Restoring the Ten Commandments in Ourselves. And she has different authors who talk about each one of the commandments and how they could be applied to our world today. If you want a more maybe scholarly approach, there's a book edited by Markle that goes through the Ten Commandments as well. In terms of what people watch, I think the Polish filmmaker Krzysztof Kieslowski's series Decalogue is fascinating, where he's got a short film about an hour long for each one of the 10, and he applies them to kind of 1980s Poland and how they get lived out. What does it mean to bear false witness or not? It's really fascinating. Maybe to get less highbrow too, there's a Simpsons episode called Homer versus Lisa and the Eighth Commandment, where Homer has, I'll give away the plot a little bit, he has stolen a streaming cable service because he doesn't want to pay for cable. And so his daughter Lisa becomes very convicted that this is theft, this is stealing. And so it's quite, in typical Simpsons mode, quite funny, and yet also there's a really thoughtful, serious underlying message in terms of what this means to steal or not steal. So those are a few things that come to mind. There's so many books on the Sabbath. Also, that if people want to read about the Sabbath, there's several other things that I think are helpful, and I'd love to suggest that people look at those instead of just my overview of reception history of that. But that's what I'd start with.
Okay. Wow. I think no one has recommended The Simpsons so far. That
Okay.
is, and I did an episode where we talked about humor, and somehow
Mm,
I don't know that The Simpsons got recommended.
yeah.
The not bearing false witness just reminded me. I just today on my walk with my dogs, I was listening to Gulliver's Travels. I thought I didn't finish it like 20 something years
Mm,
ago when I read it. I did. I guess I felt like I had probably put it down too early, but no, I remember everything that I listened to. But there's a like the honesty thing when he's
yeah.
and I'm interested to see how the AI that does the transcripts for this is gonna render the Whinham
Oh,
when he's with the Whinham and the Yahoos, which are the horses, and then the the savage people. Um, the Whinham will not say the thing that is not. They will not lie.
mm, yeah.
And it does not make sense to them that someone would say the thing that is not. And yeah, his take on that, like the narrator Gulliver, his take on that is just like, I wish everybody writing a travel log, which is what this is. It's like he's satirizing
Yeah.
travel logs. I wish everyone who did one of these would swear to the truth of everything that they're saying. And it's both like,
Mm.
yeah, that's an understandable frustration, and also such a pretentious thing for you to demand other people to do. Anyway, yeah, love Gulliver's Travels. It was a lot of fun to re-listen to that. On that note, though, what do you read for fun?
Oh, I'm a pretty indiscriminate reader. So, kind of, there's not a single genre that I gravitate toward. To be honest, lately, the more, just because of everything terrible happening in our world, the more depressing books I steer a little bit clear of. But I've actually found some of the speculative fiction kind of helpful in that. I really liked the Broken Earth series
Yes.
recently. Yeah, what's the author's name? I'm blanking on it right
N.K.
now.
Jemisin.
Yes, N.K. Jemison's stuff. I thought that was actually, even though it's kind of terrible climate change, somehow I found it really hopeful in that sense. So maybe that's a caveat there. So some of the speculative fiction in that way, I sometimes appreciate how murder mysteries kind of wrap things up nicely, and maybe there's something idyllic about that it's always solved at the end, there's an answer given, maybe there's something that seems sort of eschatologically hopeful for me about that. So yeah, I do tend to prefer to read books where I can root for the characters. A recent one I really enjoyed was The Correspondent, by Virginia Evans, where it was a woman who wasn't who was complicated, but also just trying to be good. So I appreciate that as well.
Okay. Yeah. No, Broken Earth. That
Yeah.
is. I heard her years ago on Ezra Klein's podcast talking about world building, and I was like,
Yes.
I've got to see what this lady's all about. And I would recommend to the audience, don't start with the Broken Earth trilogy. Her
Yeah.
writing is so good in that you have to go back and read her earlier stuff first, because she gets so much better. I'm not saying she was bad. She was
Yeah.
already very good, but she was like so much better by the time she got to Broken Earth trilogy and had honed her craft so much. I would say start with her earlier stuff, and you'll be pleasantly surprised. Yeah, she's really good.
Yeah.
I look, and I'm sure that the audience is probably tired of hearing me throw this one out there. Naomi Novik has a series called the Scholomance series. Have you heard of this?
Okay. I have. Are those the ones that are set in like the magic school?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes.
Yeah.
And I don't know, like 2 months ago, 3 months ago, a coworker I don't get to see that often, she's just kind of in and out. I was standing outside talking to someone else, and she from a ways away, she was walking toward me, and she goes, "I just started book 3." And then
Oh,
don't say anything. And I was like, I won't. But they're
that's
yeah, they're really good. They're not the lightest. It's
yeah.
probably on par with Broken Earth,
Okay.
but yeah, I would highly recommend that. I loved those books.
Nice.
I'm looking for like I read them last year, like with the paper copy. I'm looking forward to, because I'm kind of a stickler for my Goodreads reading goal.
Hmm.
I'm looking forward to 2026 coming so I can get the audiobooks and listen to those next year and get credit on my
Nice.
reading goal for next year, for
Nice.
rereading those. Well, Sarah Koenig, I won't take up any more of your time. Just talking about books I like.
We could do that all day, I'm
I
sure. Yeah.
yeah. So if you don't have anything else for us, I'm going to call this one good.
I don't, but thank you so much for having me. It was really fun to talk to you about the book, but then also about the other ideas that it generates, which I think is something I love about biblical studies, of how, we maybe start with the texts that are written down, and yet the ideas that they help us think about are so much more expansive. So I
I
love that.
Yeah, I would say that's so much of the iceberg. That's why I'm here doing this podcast, is
Yeah.
that stuff. But thank you so much for sitting down with me today, and take care.
Yeah, my pleasure. Take care.
All right. Look at you making it all the way to the end of the episode. Next week on the podcast, we have Jonathan Sedlak, and we'll be discussing his book, which is an evaluation of the Olivet Discourse from the Gospel of Matthew, and evaluating it from a point of view that says it has already been fulfilled, that it's not foretelling of something that we have yet to see. That is not a perspective that I was raised with. It's not one that I've been exposed to. I kind of know that these preterist views are out there, but they're just not something I've ever investigated. I hope that doesn't come across as too prejudicial a point of view. But I'm here to learn. So when he reached out and said that a friend of his was, I believe he used the phrase big fan. I'd have to go dig through my email. But when he said a friend of his was a big fan, that means a lot to me. That's not the only reason I had him on. He had a book with an interesting topic. It was something I wanted to learn more about. But I say that to say I mention at least once in almost every episode, if you have guest suggestions or you yourself are that guest suggestion, reach out to me at itmeanswhatitmeans@gmail.com. All one word, itmeanswhatitmeans@gmail.com. And I am not above checking my spam folder to make sure I'm not missing emails. So yeah, if you're listening to this for free, you can hear this conversation now at patreon.com/itmeanswhatitmeans podcast for $5 a month. This episode is available right now. You don't have to wait for it to come out next week. That said, I appreciate the support so much. Please enjoy this preview of my conversation with Jonathan Sedlak. And if you get a chance to love someone, you should take it. Take care.
I personally happen to believe that Matthew's gospel is either very early or late. And so I argue in my book that the final product of what we have does not depend upon whether Matthew was written first, second, or third. Theoretically, he could have lived after the destruction of Jerusalem in the first century. He could have been part of one of these early Judeo-Christian communities that scholars imagine occurred, and he's writing about his Sitzimleben, his situation in life. But my point is that, and I deal with this in my book, when I interact with that material in the modern era of interpretation, I show that, whoever's putting Matthew's gospel together, his literary point is still the same. He is, even if we assume that he's long after the events of destruction of Jerusalem, the author of Matthew's gospel is writing a story where Jesus was only talking about first century events that came to fulfillment. We ought not to conclude, as modern scholars frequently do, that if Matthew's writing after the destruction of Jerusalem, well, therefore the first half is clearly about the first century events, but the second half transitions into our future. That's not reasonable in my estimation. I show that from a literary perspective of the first century, what Matthew is doing is well within the bounds of scribal culture, especially Judean scribal culture. That is a hard fact. And that's where I stand. I think that much of the misreading or the overlooking of these structures and these literary ideas comes from generations that are distant from that culture. It's not wrong or right. It doesn't make their interpretation later on less valuable or interesting, but it just shows that there is a disconnect. Greco-Roman cultures did the same kind of literary structuring. Breck wrote a book about that. Well, he wrote a couple books about it. I think it's called Chiasmus in the New Testament. John Breck, an Eastern Orthodox scholar. Then there's also other books that deal with the composition of larger portions of the Tanakh. I forget the name of that, but it's called the literary structure of the Old Testament. There are just hundreds of resources on scribal cultures and organizing stories passed down in a way that puts them in digestible chunks and serves you a meal. And I think Matthew's gospel is doing that. I think Matthew is composing real authentic traditions in a way that he really thought was useful and clear. And I think that's worth revisiting in the modern world because we've walked very far away from it in Christian tradition.